So our speaker this evening is Stephen Evans. He's Chief Executive of the National Secular Society, which was founded in 1866 by, well done, Charles Bradlaugh, a famous MP who made it possible for atheists to take their seat in the House of Commons. He was arrested and put in the Tower a couple of times by the Speaker because he was trying to take his seat in the House of Commons. Well, Stephen has been at the National Secular Society for, I think, 14 years. He became Chief Executive in 2018, and prior to joining the NSS, he held managerial roles in the retail and charitable sector. He's a regular media commentator on the role of religion in politics and public life, and he's a keen marathon runner, and in fact he has run all the way here this evening from South London. Not quite, but he turned up earlier and has been running along the seafront apparently. So will you please give Stephen a warm welcome?
Thank you, David. Right, so tonight I'm going to talk about something that, if we're honest, people are rarely particularly interested in, I don't think. But it has recently become more of an issue, more of a topic of debate due to the death of Queen Elizabeth. And that's the relationship between church, state and the monarchy. So few regard this as the most pressing issue in British politics, particularly at the moment. I think that's fair to say. But it is, as the former Bishop of London, Richard Charters, said recently, a debate that will not go away. And it won't go away because I think it is one of the key constitutional issues of our time. And I think we should all be a little bit more interested in it. The fact that we still have a national church is a bizarre absurdity at the heart of our constitution, and I think it's harmful to British identity too. It's an anomaly and a nonsense, and one that I think needs to be addressed. As I'm sure you know, the National Secular Society advocates for disestablishment, so a separation of church and state and monarch, and I'll get on to why we think that's the most sensible approach to take in terms of church-state relations in due course. But to begin, I thought it was probably worth spending a little bit of time looking at what establishment actually is and what it entails. So in broad terms, establishment refers to a formal relationship between the church or a religion and the state in which it operates. Now, the United Kingdom is made up of 4 countries, so we've got England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. The Church of England is established in only one of those countries, in England. There's no established church in Northern Ireland or Wales. So the Church of Ireland was disestablished in 1871, and disestablishment took place in Wales in 1920. Now, the Church of Scotland has a sort of special status in Scotland, but it isn't established as such. It is wholly independent. Now, probably the most visible manifestation of Anglican establishment is probably the reigning monarch being simultaneously the head of state as well as the head of the church, holding the titles of Supreme Governor of the Church of England and Defender of the Faith. And for the avoidance of doubt, that faith is the one true Protestant faith. Now, these titles date back to the reign of King Henry VIII, and there is a lawful requirement for the monarch to be in communion with the Church of England. So this really means effectively that head of state really needs to be a Protestant, an Anglican. The coronation of King Charles will of course take place next May. The late monarch's coronation, the coronation ceremony of Queen Elizabeth, took place on the 2nd of June back in 1953 and included the oath that you can see there on the screen. So the Archbishop of Canterbury asked the Queen whether she would maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel, maintain the Protestant religion, maintain and preserve the settlement of the Church of England and its doctrine and its worship, and preserve the rights and privileges of its bishops. And to this the Queen said, "I promise I shall do." And indeed she did. And all of this overlapping of church and head of state really entrenches religious privilege deep into the UK and gives the monarchy, I think, a sort of quasi-religious character. It's an institution that we almost worship, and I think the BBC was actually quite guilty of that during the mourning period of Queen Elizabeth. I think there's this kind of undue reverence. There's almost like a blasphemy code that surrounds the royal family, as we saw with the arrest of the protester at one of the King's walkabouts, I think it was. And I think this is a bit problematic because if their authority is derived from God, then it's not entirely clear how the monarch can be held accountable for their actions by any earthly or secular authority, such as Parliament or the people. Now, the next coronation, as I say, will take place next May and will, in all likelihood, look and feel very similar to the previous one. There may be a nod to multi-faithism. Perhaps, I don't know, certainly religious leaders will be invited along this time. There were no religious leaders at the Queen's coronation, but there will be multi-faith religious leaders at this one. I don't know, maybe even the leader of the Humanists UK will be invited to attend. But nevertheless, it will be an unmistakably Anglican affair. That's because there's not really any scope whatsoever for it to be anything but. The coronation ceremony, the crowning of our head of state, is primarily a solemn religious ceremony. It's a religious service. The service includes oaths to defend religious privilege. The sovereign is then anointed, blessed and consecrated by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then Holy Communion is celebrated. Now, the thing is, we really don't need a coronation. It's wholly unnecessary. No other European monarch has one. They all got rid of them many years ago. The king could be crowned in a secular investiture at Westminster Hall. Clearly, the oath is not a prerequisite to becoming king, because Charles is already the king. And to remove the religious oath would simply require reform of the Coronation Oaths Act of 1688. And I think any law dating back to 1688 probably could use a look at. And the oath actually, though, isn't set in stone. It has been amended from time to time over the years. For example, in the 20th century, references to the Irish Church were removed from the oath to recognise that the Church of Ireland had been disestablished. But it could be argued that our monarchy can never really be truly secular, because without the claim of by the grace of God, if they don't have that divine right to rule, then where does their legitimacy really come from? So secularising the monarchy isn't really a can of worms, I think, that conservatives, small c conservatives, or the royals themselves will be keen to open. It's certainly true that the monarchy and religion are deeply interwoven. Whether the institution of the monarchy should continue at all is another question, but beyond the remit of my organisation. But there is a debate to be had, and the accession of King Charles, I think, does provide an opportunity to press the message, at least for secular reforms. And we are, at the NSS, trying to get that debate started. So here's a piece I wrote for The Independent recently. Again, not arguing that the monarchy, certainly not arguing for abolition of the monarchy, as I say, not within our remit. But if we are to have a monarchy, then our line is that it should be secular, and disestablishment should deliver that. And as I say there, we do expect our monarchs to remain strictly neutral when it comes to political matters, so it's not clear why there's a double standard when it comes to religion. So the monarchy, the relationship between the monarchy and religion, that's one pillar of establishment. Another manifestation of church establishment is, of course, the bishop's bench. So the UK Parliament is the only one, it's the only national legislature, certainly in Europe, that has explicit religious representation. The Isle of Man does, but yeah, it's just ours in the Isle of Man. Outside of Europe, the only one that has any sort of explicit religious representation is Iran. There's always at least one Lord Spiritual in the House of Lords when it's sitting to read prayers at the start of day. But there are often several there, especially when they have a particular interest in whatever is being debated. You can see the benches are full there. That was when they were debating assisted dying. So the official proceedings of the House can't actually begin until prayers have been read. The same goes for the House of Commons too, by the way, where prayers are led there by the Speaker's chaplain. So, like other members of the House of Lords, all 860 of them I think there are at the moment, bishops are able to take part in all the business of the House, including tabling and asking questions of ministers, leading or speaking in debates. The Archbishop of Canterbury actually has his own debate every year in December. They scrutinise legislation, they vote, they serve on committees in all party groups. So the privileges of the seats in the Lords, it extends far beyond their right to vote. It's not just simply a case of being able to vote. It gives bishops, church bishops, unique access to ministers, lawmakers, and the corridors of power, the kind of influence beyond any other religious or secular special interest group could ever really dream of. Another aspect of establishment is the church commissioners in the House of Commons. So the church commissioners are a body which administers the considerable property assets of the Church of England. So the Queen appoints a senior backbench MP from the governing party as the second Church Estates Commissioner. The current second Church Estates Commissioner is this fella, Andrew Sellis, MP, who's an evangelical Christian. So the second Church Estates Commissioner is required actually to be an Anglican, and he's entitled to speak at any committee of the commissioners. Their role is really to represent the Church of England's interests in the House of Commons and to answer questions from MPs. So in addition to the second Church Estates Commissioner, there's also the Speaker's chaplain. The current one here is Reverend Canon Patricia Hillis. So the chaplain, as I said, reads prayers in the House of Commons chamber before every sitting. As you know, all parliamentary sittings begin with parliamentary prayers. It sort of works as an antiquated seat reservation system, particularly on busy days. If you're not there for prayers, it's hard to get a seat. On days like today, when it's Prime Minister's questions. So she also provides a weekly service as well in the a service of Holy Communion that's celebrated in Parliament's own chapel. Parliament has its own chapel, St Mary Undercroft, it's called. So perhaps another aspect of establishment worth thinking about is the continued role that the Church of England plays in state education. Now, faith schools aren't directly linked to establishment. The Church could still continue to act as an education provider, even if it were disestablished. But the role the Church, and of course now other faith groups, play in state education is, I think, in a large part down to the privileged role that the Church enjoys in our political settlement and so society more broadly. So a quarter of all primary schools are run by the Church of England, which gives the Church significant say over education policy. And I think this is the reason why we still have a law requiring collective worship in all schools, a daily act of collective worship in all schools. We have an exemption from Equality Law that allows church schools to discriminate in admissions in favour of churchgoers, and we have an outdated version of RE, I think, that allows faith groups to very much control the subject still. They control the syllabus, which to this day still must broadly reflect the Christian nature of the country. And I think the presence of an established church is a real significant barrier to achieving a truly secular education system free from religious discrimination or control. Now, due to its established status, the Church, of course, also has a prominent role in our ceremonies and state occasions. So the Church, as you can see here, has a dominant role in our national ceremony of remembrance, which is the annual ceremony at the cenotaph. And it does largely, my impression of it, certainly when I was growing up and still to this day I think it largely resembles a church service. Albeit, actually, Andrew Copson, as head of Humanists UK, has been invited along recently to join the other faith leaders. But for me, that doesn't make it sufficiently inclusive. It should be an entirely secular affair. Dan Snow, the historian, wrote a piece for our website, actually, some time ago now, on why remembrance is so important and why it needs to be meaningful to people. And if it's not meaningful, people switch off, and if they switch off, they forget. So, given that religion is a turn-off for so many people, particularly young people, I think our national service of remembrance, having a distinctly religious feel, isn't particularly ideal. And then there's, of course, the coronation, which I covered earlier. It'll be interesting to see the reaction that the next coronation, what the reaction of the public is to the next coronation, which, as I said, will be a very, very religious affair, because the nation's religion and belief landscape has changed beyond all recognition since 1953. So it'll be interesting to see how the public respond, how they react to a religious service to mark the crowning of the new king. Another aspect of establishment is the role the state actually plays in the church. So it works the other way around too. Key matters of church governance, including theological decisions about the Book of Common Prayer, for example, are passed as what's called measures by the General Synod of the Church of England's. That's the Church of England's highest governing body. They are still subject, these Church of England laws, they are still subject to formal approval by both houses of Parliament at Westminster, and they require royal assent in order to become law. So church law is actually very much part of the legal system of the UK. And the influence of the state also extends to the filling of key positions within the church as well. So this is a recent press release, a government press release, announcing a new Church of England bishop. So bishops and archbishops are appointed by the ruling monarch, but acting on advice from the Prime Minister. Now, until the mid-1970s, the Prime Minister had an unfettered right to advise on appointments, and the church really had no formal process whatsoever in the appointing process of its own bishops and archbishops at all, although it was invariably consulted as a matter of courtesy. And in 1976, the Church of England was given a more prominent role in the appointment of bishops. So the Church of England since then have been asked to come up with a list of 2 possible bishops or archbishops. That list is given to the MP, and there's also a first and second preference on there, but the MP decides. So on 3 separate occasions, Margaret Thatcher actually overrode the wishes of the church and appointed the name that was second amongst the preferences that the church gave rather than the first choice. In 1997, it was actually reported that Tony Blair rejected both of the candidates that were put forward by the Church of England to succeed David Shepherd as the Bishop of Liverpool. And of course, the role of the Prime Minister in selecting or advising on archbishops becomes a little bit problematic if the PM isn't an Anglican. So under the law, no person professing the Roman Catholic religion is allowed to advise the Queen on the selection of Church of England bishops, which seems to make sense. But that did leave our nominally Catholic former Prime Minister Boris Johnson in a bit of a tricky situation recently. So instead, the Lord Chancellor, Robert Buckland, had to be drafted in to play that role. So again, we see this assumption that this settlement makes, this assumption that our political leaders will be Anglican. Appointments to other church positions, such as deans, deacons and priests, are also quite heavily shaped by the views of state officials. So as you can see, there's plenty of state meddling going on in church affairs, which as a secularist, I don't support. I think the Church of England, like all other religions, should enjoy complete independence from this kind of state interference. Alongside this, the established status of the Church of England requires it to conduct a national mission to minister to the whole of the English population, even you lot. So this involves the provision of pastoral care in every local area, along with a legal duty to marry and baptise all of those who reside within the parish. And of course, this became a little bit of an issue when same-sex marriage was legislated for. The church sought and were granted amendments to ensure the duty to marry parishioners didn't extend to same-sex couples. It also protected the Church of England's canon law, which does say that marriage is the union of one man and one woman and nothing else. So I mentioned the role of the Second Church Estates Commissioner earlier, who represents the Church of England's interests in the House of Commons. But that same person also maintains the statutory accountability of the Church to Parliament too, and is regularly questioned and quizzed by MPs on church affairs. So in various ways, the Church of England is very much still subservient to the state. So how did all this come about? How did establishment come about? Well, as you'll all probably know, I'm sure you're aware, it was the refusal of the Pope to annul the marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon that led to King Henry VIII abolishing papal authority in 1534 and making himself the supreme head of the Church of England. So as Geoffrey Robinson QC, Casey I suppose it is now, King's Counsel, pointed out in one of our Bradlaugh lectures on this topic, our current constitutional arrangement, it wasn't the result of any moral or intellectual movement. It's not a source of national pride, but a somewhat grubby affair. Essentially, the Church of England was established by the lust of a pathological monster. That's how Henry VIII was described by the Tudor historian Tracy Borman over Anne Boleyn's execution in the Tower of London. Apparently Henry wanted her burnt at the stake, but in the end, out of pity, settled for a simple beheading. But that's how it all began. That's how it all began. That's how we got here. That's the man responsible and the circumstances that led to our current constitutional settlement. It all dates back from an era, of course, when church and state were virtually indistinguishable. But the nature of establishment has changed over the years. On the screen you can see various reforms that took place during the 19th century. So establishment used to entail financial support for the church from the state. However, not since the first half of the 19th century has the Church of England received any grant not equally available to other denominations. At least in theory. In practice, it's a little bit different. The Church of England does still receive large amounts of public money for the maintenance of its buildings, some of which you might argue can be justified in terms of our national heritage, which I think is fair enough. But we've worked out that the Church of England has received around £750 million of public money in the last 5 years alone through various means. And don't forget, this is a church that sits on assets worth more than £22 billion, and they receive £750 million of public money from the state. But two forms of taxation which used to benefit the Church of England no longer exist. So the church tax, that was for the maintenance of church fabric and worship. That was abolished on a compulsory basis back in 1868, I think it was, while the tithe was phased out in 1936. But aside from public money spent on church schools, of course, there is no direct public funding that is channeled directly to the Church of England now. Nevertheless, the close relationship between the church and state is a key feature of our current constitutional settlement. So, why do I think we should change that? What is the case for disestablishment? Well, there are two principal objections, I suppose. First is that it's unfair. The existence of a legally enshrined national religion, an established church, privileges one part of the population, one institution, and one set of beliefs. Is it really appropriate for there to be seats reserved in the House of Lords for the Church of England bishops? Is it appropriate for the UK Prime Minister to have a weekly meeting with the Supreme Governor of the Church of England to discuss government matters? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. Removing the symbolic and the institutional ties between government, the monarchy and religion would, I think, go a long way to ensuring equal treatment and parity of citizenship for citizens of all faiths and beliefs. But it is the case, and I think we need to acknowledge this, that Anglican establishment does enjoy some support from other religions, or at least from religious leaders. Why is that? Well, King Charles has made it clear that his intention is to be a defender of faith generally, not only the faith. Technically, he is absolutely defender of the faith, but he has made it clear that he wants to protect faith more generally. And this fits in, of course, with the role that the Church of England has sort of taken on for itself as being a means by which other denominations and faith communities can be elevated in public life. They see their establishment role as to give a leg up to other religions in the public square. It's unclear to what extent individual members of other faiths are content to ride on the coattails of Anglican establishment. And it's also not clear to what extent many Anglicans actually want to promote other faiths in public. But when it is clear that many faith leaders do enjoy the enhanced status that is granted to them by way of the Church of England sort of holding the door open for them. Now, humanists may on occasion be invited along to the multi-faith table, but ultimately I think the favouritism that's shown to the Church of England with a sort of crumbs from the table for other religious groups, I think it demeans minority faiths actually, and almost entirely neglects and disenfranchises the non-religious and the religiously unconcerned who don't get a place at the table. Multi-faithism doesn't give them a voice. Now, it is true that the late Queen Elizabeth and King Charles have been advocates for religious freedom. I too am a big believer in freedom of religion or belief. I think we all should be. But it's not clear how the monarchy's support for religious freedom, how consistent really that is with the role of a head of state being reserved exclusively for practicing Christians. The monarchy's religious role is, as I said, underpinned by an assumption that all future monarchs will be believing Anglicans. The Constitution actively prevents Catholics from becoming the monarch. And of course, this all runs absolutely contrary to concepts of fairness and freedom of religion or belief. Not only does our setup make second-class citizens out of non-Anglicans, it also makes second-class citizens out of lesbian, gay and bisexual people. So the Archbishop of Canterbury recently reaffirmed his church's official rejection of gay sex and of same-sex marriage. Now, the Church of England's doctrine is entirely its own affair, but as we've been pointing out in this recent ad campaign, surely an officially homophobic institution shouldn't be part of the state. And actually Justin Welby's attempt to hold disagreeing factions of the Anglican communion together actually have worrying implications for the state church. The Church of England's General Synod recently voted to give overseas Anglican leaders greater power in choosing the Archbishop of Canterbury. So this will give greater weight to the views of the more orthodox Anglican bishops who reject gay sex and same-sex marriage as incompatible with Scripture. So in an attempt to kind of hold the Anglican communion together, to save the Anglican communion, the Church of England is actually likely to become more religiously conservative, further alienating itself from the country it supposedly serves. And for me, this only reinforces the need for disestablishment and a rethink of the privileged role of the church in public and political life of the country. Now, the second argument I have against the sovereign and established church is that it's simply inauthentic. It's no good pretending that this country is still, in any meaningful way, a Christian country. Christianity is, of course, one major influence, but one major influence amongst many that's shaped our current way of life. We can't, in any meaningful sense, still be described as a Christian country. The concept of a national church is really at odds with the diverse and pluralistic nature of today's UK. The number of people who describe themselves as belonging to the Church of England is at a record low. Just look at the data and you can see that the Church of England, certainly Church of England establishment, has become something of an absurd anachronism. So the UK, we're the 6th least religious country in the world. Around half British people have no religion. Just 12% of Brits are affiliated to the Church of England. Average Sunday attendance in 2019 was down to 600,000. That's fewer than 1% of the population. Just 1% of young adults identify in any way with the Church of England. 60% of Brits don't think religion is important in their lives. 81% of us agree that religious practice should be a private matter and should be separated from the political and economic life of the country. More of us oppose than support the idea of the UK having an official state religion. 58% of the population oppose faith schools, and British citizens, including churchgoers, overwhelmingly reject the Church's position on abortion, on assisted dying, and on same-sex marriage. So establishment simply doesn't sit well with the reality. It's out of date, it's past its sell-by date, and I think this matters. I think we really need a strong national identity, an identity that people can buy into. I think it's important for integration, and I think it's important for social cohesion. I think we need a stronger sense of who we are as a nation. I think we need a sense of shared citizenship based around universal values that we can all sign up to. And I think becoming a secular state, I think by doing that we can start to build a more inclusive and a more positive national identity, rather than this sort of vaguely Christian identity that we currently have that not too many of us buy into and isn't particularly inclusive. Just take our national anthem, for example. Now, I consider myself to be fairly patriotic, but as an atheist and as a Republican, God Save the King isn't something I can sing. I can't really sing at all, actually, but it's not something I can sing with any authenticity whatsoever. It's just not something I can get passionate about. A sycophantic hymn just isn't really for me. And I think lots of people feel the same way, so I think it's the anthem that's out of step, not me. So it's also worth acknowledging, I think, that the existence of an established church is, internationally speaking, an anomaly. According to one study, just 25% of countries around the world have a state religion. That's 48 from 192 countries, and just 18 of these, 37%, were classed as liberal democracies. So we are an anomaly. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Nothing wrong with being a bit quirky, I suppose. But we do need to recognise, I think, that what we do in this country is not particularly normal. A third objection to establishment comes not from me, but from those within the established church itself. There are arguments for disestablishment, and I'm increasingly hearing these, actually, from Anglicans and from broader Christian perspectives too. So this is a new book by Jonathan Chaplin, and in his book, Beyond Establishment, Jonathan argues that the C of E should voluntarily relinquish its privileges and established status to free the church to pursue its own mission with greater authenticity. And as I say, it's an argument that we are hearing increasingly from Anglicans who value the ideal of church autonomy and recognise the importance of state impartiality. A former Anglican vicar, Colin Buchanan, also wrote a book called Cut the Connection, and he argued that disestablishment is the overriding policy the Church of England ought to pursue in relation to the state today. And as I was preparing this talk just a couple of weeks ago, Martin Percy, a British academic, theologian, and Church of England priest, wrote a piece for Prospect magazine arguing that the Church should surrender its seats in the House of Lords and stop trying to cling to the privilege and power of the past. Earlier this year, Martin actually announced he was leaving the Church of England because of concerns he had over its management of safeguarding, as well as bullying and harassment within the church. But Martin is an Anglican, and yeah, an Anglican for disestablishment. And then we have Tim Farron, who isn't an Anglican, but he is a Christian. So with former Lib Dem leader, he's probably one of the most evangelical Christians in Parliament today, but he told Robert Preston, "I've always been someone who believes very strongly in a secular society. I believe very much that the church should be disestablished." And we have, writing in the Times back in 1989, I think this was, the religious commentator Clifford Longley said, "Any Christian church which still needs official state privilege for support has chosen to manacle itself to a spiritual corpse. In their heart, everybody knows it, but no one will admit it." We've got Justin Welby himself. He said disestablishment wouldn't be a disaster for the Church of England, but he did make it clear that the church wouldn't be initiating any change. He said it was a decision for Parliament and people. So, for the time being, it seems the church is unwilling to unshackle itself from that spiritual corpse that Clifford Longley spoke of. And it's understandable, I suppose, those who benefit from religious establishment will instinctively cling to it. Not least, of course, Welby and the bishops whose seats in the House of Lords give them considerable political lobbying power and prestige. But bishops aside, it is clear that many Christians would support disestablishment. And I only say this to point out that disestablishment, it need not be a big clash between church and state. Lots of people think this is something that's going to happen to the church, it's done to the church. But I don't think it needs to be that way. Many within the church think disestablishment may be the best strategy for its own survival in an increasingly secular society. So it could be progressed with a mutual understanding that a formal separation could actually benefit both parties. All sides can surely recognise that maintaining a minority established church in a religiously pluralistic and largely non-religious secularised nation is really unsustainable. So, for all of these reasons that I've mentioned this evening, I think we need to reset the relations between church and state. I think it will help Britain to become a fairer, more modern state rather than one which continues to cleave to its outdated privileges and institutions that are no longer really particularly relevant to contemporary society. At the same time, I know this is going to be a considerable challenge. For some people, as I say, there will always be more pressing matters, and I think it's probably right to recognise that in this country there's never been a big appetite for constitutional issues until Brexit, perhaps. That got people very passionate, and that was a constitutional matter. So I don't know, maybe things are changing. And there is, I think, still clearly a strong attachment to tradition in this country. There's a fondness for the costumed British pageantry that we saw recently. But of course we can keep a lot of that. But concepts of nationhood and citizenship, I think, are too important to centre around an anachronism. And that's what church establishment is. The idea of us being a Christian country, it's an anachronism. And the UK's drift away from Christianity, it does look set to continue. I don't think there's going to be any kind of reversal of fortune for the Church of England. Majority of Brits don't belong to any religion these days. Minority faiths, particularly Islam, have seen a significant growth. Maybe belief in Islam will be up to 6-8%, I don't know, in the forthcoming census, which will be, the data will be coming in the next month or two for that, I think. So I do think we need a long-term, sustainable settlement on the relationship between church and state, and I think any future settlement should be based on the principles of secularism. So it should provide a clear separation between religion and state, an end to religious privilege, and it should deliver equality for all, irrespective of religion or belief. So get on with it, is my message. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So we've got plenty of time for questions.